Good morning. It's good to see you all here. Welcome. In this class today, we want to look at the nature, features, and language of poetry before moving on in the next class to look at the place of poetry in the biblical writings and in the book of Psalms in particular. And so in this class, we want to give you a deeper and greater understanding of what poetry is doing, how it works, and how it does the various functions and actions that it does, so that you can apply this in the study of the Psalms and poetry in the Bible. So first question is, how does poetry work? I could inform you of historical events relating to the death of Abraham Lincoln, and I could tell you that Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States, and he was shot in 1965 by a stage actor named William Booth, or John Wilkes Booth. He was attending a play at the time. Alternatively, I could read you a poem. "O Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done, and the ship has weathered every rack, and the prize we sought is won. The port is near, the bells I hear, the people are all exulting, while follow eyes the steady keel, the vestige grim and daring. But oh heart, 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 oh the bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen, cold and dead. My captain does not answer, his lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm, he has no pulse nor will." This is part of a poem by Walt Whitman, also on the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and it captures the imagination and heart in ways that a recounting of the events can't do. And if you go to a football match or a sport match and hear the coach speaking, it'll often be with poetic language. If you hear a politician like Martin Luther King speaking about "I have a dream," then it's poetic emotion that stirs us and moves us and draws us in. It's poetic language that captures the deeper insights of the heart. And we want to think in this lesson briefly about the ways in which poetry does that. And then we want to look in the next lesson about how we might see these various characteristics of poetry outworked in Scripture. C.S. Lewis, in the Language of Religion book, writes, "Poets are always telling us that grass is green, thunder loud, lips are red. This is the most remarkable of the powers of poetic language, is to convey the quality of experiences." One reason why poetry works so powerfully is the short, terse lines with few words. And these capture emotions and insights partly from what is left out. Again, we see fraught with detail or lack of detail to be a characteristic of poetry. And this stirs the imagination to fill in the gaps. And the metaphors, often of unparalleled connections, that is, trees clapping their hands, cause us to bring together things that the mind hadn't previously thought of, stirring us to think and reflect more deeply. Poetry also uses rhythm or repetition to slow down thinking, and this encourages reflection or meditation on what is being said. It touches deep subconscious thoughts and emotions as it brings up metaphors and parallels, and it stirs these emotions and imagination to picture things which might be, possibilities and hopes and beauty, or ways that we might overcome difficulty or dread or fear. Poetry uses metaphors to raise unexpected connections between literal facts and parallel images that at times would appear unrelated to the facts. And it uses parallelisms or similar but changed lines. It has one line and then another in which there's some changes made, but similarities carried through to encourage the heightening of similarities, contrast and completion of the images, and to heighten this reflection on what is being said. The rhythm and parallels lead to a meditative experience in which we can often be lifted out of the present world in which we live into another world, space, time, dimensional area in which we're able to contemplate these great hopes or thoughts that are reflected in the poem. Poem works with association of ideas, often real literal facts, but parallel metaphors. Lyric poetry is also often personal, in which the poet expresses their thoughts and feelings, capturing intense emotional moments or insights. And this personal subjective verse and lyric is not usually directed to the broad audience in general, but rather to a particular audience, such as the poet, author is speaking to God or to the nation or the starry night sky or to a specific person who is mentioned, or a romance between two people. We're eavesdropping, as it were, on private thoughts. So poetry is an expression of that which is deep within, which others are able to share. What is poetry? Edgar Allan Poe, in a famous definition, said it's the rhythmic creation of beauty. So there's rhythm in poetry between the lines, one followed by another. And then there's also a sense of beauty. There's captivating metaphors or images, and there's a terseness, short, sharp statement in which many words are left out that stimulate creativity in the minds of the authors and the listeners, stimulating the imagination to picture what is very beautiful, to picture insights that we've not seen or imagined before. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow, said William Wordsworth, of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility, again escaping to this space of peacefulness and reflection. It's spontaneous and intuitive in contrast to the rational. It draws from the deep subconscious and shares and connects with the subconscious in other people. It flows out of the subconscious rather from the deliberate conscious reasoning, and it taps into unexpressed or unexpressible aspects of the subconscious in order to communicate truths from these areas to other people that resonate with their understanding of subconscious experiences. John Milton said it's simple, sinuous, and passionate. That is, it connects to the senses and the emotions. Samuel Coleridge said, words in their best order is prose, but poetry is the best words in the best order. It's short and sharp. Molly Peacock said, the art that offers depth in a moment. And Auden said, it's memorable speech. Poems and lyrics typically have a single theme that carries the poem through, but it's looked at in different ways, often the real and the metaphorical. For example, the theme could be loneliness, and there could be realities about loneliness, together with images and pictures that continue to carry that forward. So what are some other aspects of poetry that we've noted and could note further? One is rhythm that represses the chaotic inner-outer events of everyday life and gives opportunity to step into a rhythmic escape, meditative reflection in which we find this change of rhythm from the chaos of life to the rhythm of the poem transports us, takes us to this restful world. And that's why we like to sing songs that use poetic language and rhythm. They're an opportunity to escape for a while into another world. Often the rhythm will release tension. The rhythm can be carried by the beat of the words, the repetition of sounds, or the repetition of language. And in looking at biblical poetry, since we're not all familiar with the sound of the Hebrew language, it's the rhythm of the parallel lines that we see. And this repetition and beat of lines or rhythm through other means can create a secret place, a bridge to the unconscious from which the poem springs and to which the poem speaks. As participants respond to the gentle suggestions of a poem, the insights that they see in a poem. They'll see more and more and begin to speak more and more. Isolation can be broken as we share in a song together, or a poem together, or an anthem together. Poetry also has form, and in free verse, the constraints of couplets and quatrains no longer exist, and the rhyme is removed. But poetry that we often read has shape and form. So there's a combination between free expression together with some reworking in order to give this structure. Children often love dancing to the words of a poem and listening to the words of a poem and drawing circles and spirals and arrows to reflect their emotions. And often rules can fly out the window as people play with poems. Polysemy is the capacity of a word or phrase to have multiple related meanings. And so it's different to homophony, where there's a similarity between two words. It's this capacity for a word to have multiple meanings that increases the thought and reflection in a poem. Terry Eggleton, in How to Read a Poem, begins by discussing criticism and says, yes, there is a time for content analysis, but I think there's also a need for close reading that is open to reflection on the emotion. Close reading, says Eggleton, is not just the issue. The question is, how tenaciously do you cling to the text? What do you search for? And what are you open to that comes into your mind as you read? Well, Eggleton has much to say about theory. He's also concerned with practice, and he's seeking to show that while close reading of a poem is seeking to look at context and background and what the author intends, there's also a need to, that Eggleton is getting at to understand the way in which it resonates with the human person. So I want to encourage you in reading the Psalms or biblical poetry or other poetry to be informed about the background setting and authorship and context, but also to be open to questions about what's going on in the minds of readers when they read a poem. What is poetry? Poet Menna Alexander says, poetry's task is to use these short rhythmic poetry lines to reconcile us to the realities of our world, but to go beyond obvious surface level observations. So poetry digs deep into realities of life, but it does this by connecting with insights and thoughts that go beyond the everyday. Poetry is not just to accept the world at face value or to assent that things are wrong or to say that they're right, but rather to be reconciled in a larger sense to bigger dreams and concepts such as love and the imagination and the scope of mortal lives and the eternal. Says Alexander, Menna Alexander, what use is poetry? And you might want to look that up and explore further what she says. Alexander says, poetry takes as its purview what is deeply felt and essentially unsayable. So poetry touches on that which is most difficult to give expression to, such as friendship and love and hope in the midst of difficulty. And this is the paradox on which a poem turns. So a poet uses language as a painter uses colors as the material to make an artistic representation of what might be, of hopes not fully grasped as yet. And this is different to advertisements or political rhetoric, where you've got to be free of that to some extent in poetry, although you may want to work with it. Poetry is about the senses of inner being that are harder to touch with everyday language. And so poetry touches that which is more difficult to touch. Shelley, in Defence of Poetry, 1821, looked at lines in which he evokes the unbidden power of the poem. He says it creates for us a being within our being. It makes us inhabitants of a world to which the familiar becomes like chaos. It takes us to another world, and it reproduces the common universe in which we're all portions and percipients. It purges us, the inward sight of the familiar, and opens up a sense of wonder. So poetry takes us out of the familiar to new ways of seeing. One person in the New York City 9/11 disaster said poetry was a way to survive, as they wrote on bits of paper that they carried around with them. They said that poetry is powerfully redemptive and it has healing capacities. Malouf says, we are free to transcend ourselves if we have imagination for it. Keith Ward observes that imagining the inexpressible, such as salvation, can repair evils we bring upon ourselves. The divine mind in the poetic can save humans from the word consequences of their often absurd choices. And poetry can bring us to a sense of embodied transcendence, moving beyond this world towards the world to which we've been called, beyond this. Poetry is the response of our innermost being to ecstasy, agony, and the all-embracing mysteries of life. It's a song, a sigh, or a cry, bringing them all together, says Charles Angell. And poetry humanizes the links between individuals through its rhythms and its words. Poetry helps to ease the aloneness of what we all share in common, said Myra Livingston. So poetry is an emotional, intellectual construct, says Dobbins, that touches the heart of the reader. And as Dobbins says, poetry goes beyond the rational and the intellectual to engage the deep emotional understandings of the human person. Alison Wee, in writing on the value of poetry, says that she does want students to get good jobs and to be trained for that. But she wants them all to seek and to know and value the immaterial, the transcendent that takes them beyond the everyday, because it's poetry that allows us to see and to feel, and briefly to see and to feel what others see and to feel, to understand that which we have in common with one another. So the hard truth is that there are endless things that we've got to survive out there that money and job skills don't touch, and poetry can help us in those moments. So poets look around the world in uncommon ways, and they see things that the common everyday eye doesn't see. In the same word, Wordsworth wrote, the principal object of poetry is to choose incidents and situations from common life and to throw over them new insights, colouring of the imagination, unusual ways of seeing. So poetry is most simply language put together in a form that differs from regular speech and prose. And it's this difference that is important, because it's the difference that encourages us to look at life in new ways and then to move on in and through these new ways of understanding. So when students read a biblical text or other text, what they should be looking for is partly what is there, but they should also be looking for the way in which it activates realities within the person. And as Paul Ricoeur, the French scholar and philosopher, has said, it's the reading of a text that is as important as what the written text is saying. So from epic narratives that shaped ancient cultures to the prayerful expressions of religious devotees today, it's the insights of poetry and lyrics that tell us a great deal about the human condition and the miraculous world that we inhabit that goes beyond the everyday. The hard truth is that there's endless things that we've got to survive, but there is hope in the poem to speak to us. Poetry can also be useful in therapy. And so poetry can be helpful, whether it be an individual reading a psalm or a poem, getting a sense of the hope in God that takes them beyond their present situation, or dealing with a difficulty that one has. There's whole centres of poetry therapy that have been established that encourage people to make use of the benefits of poetry. And poetry as therapy is sometimes used to describe this. So therapy is a Greek word for the service of one to another, the caring of one to another. And poetry is able to do this through entering space and rhythm where poetry dwells, and giving voice to the subjective I, so that people can find expression for their emotions. So how does poetry as therapy work? It gives expression to the emotions and to the reader. It resonates with the emotions in the reader and gives expression to them. And I've found many occasions where people have been going through difficulties and they have been encouraged to read poetry such as the Psalms, and they've found help and healthy response through the reading of these Psalms at such a time. And so I would encourage you, turn to a Psalm such as Psalm 23 and read through those verses there and reflect on the benefits that come from reading through a reminder that the Lord is our shepherd. We shall not want. He leads us into green pastures, and though we go through a valley of the shadow of death, he's with us there. And he looks after us, he protects us. And in being reminded of these things through poetic expression, we can find great hope that transcends our everyday, and we can share that hope with one another. So poetry, and for us as Christians, the poetry of the Bible and the Psalms is able to be of great assistance and help to us in many, many situations. I hope these insights into the nature of poetry are helpful to you to look at the poems in the books of the Bible in fresh ways, and to gain new insights as you look into these. Thank you.